Today I'm going to be talking about how I made this painting, and more importantly really the process of how I started with the initial concept and got it to this finished piece. Now, I don't have the best of lighting on it, so it does look a little bit flatter than it is in real life. I also haven't varnished it, so the colors are going to look a little bit desaturated, but I'm hoping I'll be able to put up a photo of it once it's done varnishing and kind of like make those final adjustments so you get a better idea of what it should look like. Because right now it's a little bit flatter, a little bit duller than it was during the painting process, just because the colors are kind of like dried out. But initially the sketch was supposed to be this kind of 1700s European painting style of like a shepherd kind of overlooking this big valley from the back. And I really wanted to highlight these like red kind of draped cloth. I knew I wanted to do something with like extreme kind of lighting or colors. And so in the process of looking for reference photos, I came across these figures of these women wearing all black outfits and like these witch hats. And it really caught my attention because it felt like something out of a fantasy setting, but these were real people. And so in Yemen, specifically in Hadramaut, I think that's how you pronounce it, or Hadramaut, there's this valley where there are these female shepherds, where these women will wear these black, kind of like a hijab, but they're full black clothes covering the hands, everything because of the conditions of the weather, and these big witch-like kind of straw hats to protect their face and block out the sun. And so as soon as I saw this reference image, I knew immediately I wanted to do something with it, just because this juxtaposition of like this fantasy kind of figures, but being based on a real thing, looked really cool. And so I started with some initial sketches, knowing that I wanted to kind of capture a bit of that valley and like do like this kind of like big kind of landscape setting with the figures, and put up the photos. But initially I just did a lot of studies of the figures themselves to kind of understand the shapes, because they're very dark, they're wearing all black, and so the silhouette is going to definitely be really important. And I also really wanted to capture some extreme lighting conditions with this kind of like half-lit kind of sunset setting with the canyons in the background. And so I started off with some initial sketches. I figured out my rough composition, do a lot of iterations of these quick thumbnail sketches. Not too big, maybe like 3 by 2 inches, give or take. Once I was happy with like a rough composition, I think that was the point where I knew I wanted to do some like interesting lighting settings, and it'd be tough to kind of imagine it. And it was also tricky to find good reference images of people who were kind of underneath the shadow of like a canyon while the sun was kind of like half lit. It was really easy to find either images of either the canyons being half lit, like this one, but not so much of figures being in the shadow with the lighting being behind them, kind of like this cut-off angle. And so I took to Blender at that point, where I sculpted a quick kind of mock-up of like these canyons in ZBrush, and then I pulled it over to Blender, and then I set up a scene where I could basically put all the elements together. But I basically pulled together a couple of basic shapes. I used like these columns, not columns, cylinders for the witches. I found a goat 3D model online or somewhere, and just threw a couple of instances of it in the scene just to kind of get the rough shape of the shadow. And then I used I think it was the sky node. I'll put up the node on the screen in Blender to simulate the sun. And that basically did most of the work, honestly, just getting and like tweaking that node to like really get the colors. And then I used a couple of materials, especially on the rocks. And I think I used the material on the sandstone as well, like in the foreground. But that was it was basically the same thing, but just a little bit less chromatic, a little more of like that sandy color than that like orangish color. And then I think I put a black material on the witches, just to kind of see what that color difference would look like from when they're in the shadow versus the light. it kind of ended up just being that when they're in the shadow, it's basically pitch black or your darkest dark, and then when they're lit up, it's like these orangish chromatic browns, just because it still stays pretty dark even though it's in direct sunlight because it is black material. Once all of that was kind of figured out, I did a color study of just the scene, just to kind of see what my pigments would actually look like, because I've had issues in the past, and I think this is a challenge when you paint using the screen as a reference, where sometimes your colors on the screen are going to be just lighter than you can achieve with real paints because it's backlit, or the colors are outside of the color gamut of the pigments you have. And so I really wanted to do this color study to figure out kind of tones and like how I want the colors to work, and playing with like basically this big kind of like, I wanted warm oranges and like these cool kind of subdued shadows. And so I guess the play between the orange and the blue colors, I really wanted to figure that out. So once the color study was done, I was basically ready to work. So I used a 22 by 28 inch, I think it was cotton canvas, nothing super fancy. 2 layers of acrylic gesso, and then I stained the canvas kind of a gray color. See if I can find an image of what it looked like. I do wish I kind of used a raw umber in Prematura instead, just because I found that like if I wanted to do like the wipeout method where you kind of wipe out your highlights and your light areas and keep your darks with your Prematura color, it was tricky because it was a mixed color, and so because I worked on it over the course of a couple of days, it would have been more of a hassle to like remix that color. Could have just saved it in a jar or something, but I'm lazy, so I think next time I'll just use raw umber for my underpainting like I usually do. Once that was done, I just started working from back to light, kind of starting with the sky, putting in the gradient, working here, and then just working my way down and closer. During the sky, I do wish I used more medium when I was painting the sky, just because the paint, when I put it down in like sections, it was really tacky, and so it made it kind of difficult to blend it smoothly. It's got a little more streakiness than I would have loved, but that's a lesson for next time, is when you're trying to get really smooth gradients, I think making sure your paint is wet enough makes a big difference. Dialing in the details, I kept the goats pretty undetailed. I mean, there's hardly any detail, especially if you get close up. Kind of just blobs. I was really trying to like emulate, I guess, the effect that Sargent created in his works. It's to some degree of success where it's meant to be viewed at a certain angle. And so with this painting, I kind of designed for it to be viewed at from a good 10 to 15 feet away for it to really kind of like pop the way I wanted it to. Which is why, like, when you get close, it kind of looks a bit ugly, honestly. Like, some of the stuff doesn't look great when you're up close. There's a lot of, like, edges that are kind of like, eh. And, like, some of the shapes are a little bit awkward. But again, that was because towards, like, the entire, like, later half of the painting, I basically put down a couple of strokes, get a good 15, 20 feet away, make the decision on where I wanted to, like, adjust or put more paint. Come in, put it down, and I was just basically trying to work from a distance. And it's something I'm pretty happy with because I think it creates a really cool kind of effect where like you have a painting that works from a certain distance and it has this really interesting type of realism that's not quite as like detailed, but still just as effective as, you know, like a really well rendered, very detailed, like a small brush kind of painting. So I think the 2 key takeaways from this painting for me were, 1, using 3D softwares to create your initial composition, figuring out shapes, colors, and playing around with different materials even, is super useful for imaginary scenes. And then I think the second thing is getting far enough away from your painting to kind of let it melt into the bigger shapes, values, and colors. It's really helpful to kind of cut out a lot of the noise so you don't get too dialed in on details. And I think it also just creates a really cool effect of like having your painting work from a certain distance, it does feel really cool. It feels a little bit like magic sometimes. Well, hopefully this will be helpful. Hopefully someone gets something out of this. I kind of just made this video to talk about my process and share it in the hopes that maybe someone else will find this useful, because when I started this painting, I found it quite difficult to find resources of people talking about sort of, I guess, the planning phase and the process of all the stuff that happens before you touch the canvas with paint. And so I want to keep trying detailing and talking about that process, because I think it's really important. And in fact, I think it's arguably more important than like what you actually do on the canvas, because I think that prep work can really make or break a piece.